Frontline is a presentation of the Documentary Consortium.
And how many days did it take to win the Gulf War? 43. And how many did it take Congress to pass a national energy strategy? 532, and still counting.
Last summer, the president was goading the Congress to approve his energy plan.
The bill has passed 90.
Finally, on October 8th, after nearly 2 years of wrangling, the Congress passed a comprehensive energy bill. It is one of the few major pieces of legislation President Bush is expected to sign. Tonight on Frontline, will the government's energy bill come to grips with America's energy habit?
I feel really pretty good about it. I'm frustrated that I can't get some things through, but after all, how about 90% of the loaf?
It's an American failure from top to bottom, from the president, from the Congress, from the media, from the people.
We have an energy policy today. We will go to war to keep the oil flowing from the Middle East. That's the Bush strategy.
Tonight on Frontline, the politics of power.
With funding provided by the financial support of viewers like you and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This is Frontline. This program is a co-production with the Center for Investigative Reporting. Additional funding provided by these funders.
At stake is our very way of life. Americans own 190 million cars and trucks and consume 17 million barrels of oil each day. That's 25% of the world's oil. Half of it comes from overseas, leaving us vulnerable to oil cutoffs, recession, even war. Meanwhile, auto exhaust is choking our cities. Americans also consume 25% of the world's electricity. How we produce this power also seriously affects our economy and environment. Frontline asked Nick Kotz, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and author, to look into U.S. energy policy. Working with the Center for Investigative Reporting, Kotz has immersed himself in a story most Americans know nothing about. It's a story of fierce Washington political infighting that took place in the White House and on Capitol Hill as Americans went to war in the Gulf. The story reveals the limits of American government, showing what is possible and what is not possible in today's Washington. It was not until the 1973 Arab oil embargo that Americans ever thought much about where they got their oil. But that winter, Americans lined up for gasoline for the first time. The crisis prompted this presidential imperative.
Let us pledge that by 1980, under Project Independence, we shall be able to meet America's energy needs from America's own energy resources.
Of course, energy independence was easier pledged than realized. 4 years later, President Carter tried again to rally the people, promising more government action.
Our decision about energy will test the character of the American people and the ability of the President and the Congress to govern this nation. This difficult effort will be the moral equivalent of war.
But soon, America was caught unprepared by another Middle Eastern crisis and another oil cutoff. Then came the 80s. The Reagan administration believed that less, not more, government regulation could solve most energy problems.
Welcome. Good. As you know, our administration has repeatedly expressed the intention to abolish the Department of Energy.
We are united in the conviction that the best way to deal with our energy problems and serve the American people is to let our market economy work. And so today's legislation...
When George Bush became president, he shared Reagan's hands-off attitude towards energy, but he was also moved by the desire to show that he was different from Reagan.
We cannot and will not wait for the next energy crisis to force us to respond. And so today, I want to make this announcement. I'm directing Jim Watkins, our able Secretary of Energy, to take the lead in developing a comprehensive national energy strategy.
Admiral James Watkins was a Navy nuclear engineer who rose to Chief of Naval Operations. Watkins had already distinguished himself as a skilled Washington troubleshooter as chairman of President Reagan's AIDS Commission. Now, Bush wanted Watkins to make him the energy president.
You told Congress this is the toughest job of all. Why?
Well, you know, when you're in the Navy, you give right full rudder, and everybody goes to the right. It's wonderful. Nobody pays any attention to you in the private sector, and I've learned that kind of the hard way. We're putting together one of the most complex strategies I think the country's ever had, because embodied within the energy strategy are all the gut issues facing the economic recovery of the nation, facing the satisfaction of the American consumer, facing the environmental issues that are now becoming global in nature.
You've got a lot of different people to satisfy.
We have a lot of people to satisfy.
As he had with AIDS, Watkins began by holding a series of public hearings.
The President charged me as Secretary of Energy to craft an action plan that will balance America's energy requirements with the need for a safe and healthy environment.
He held 18 public meetings, taking testimony from nearly 500 witnesses from 43 states.
I'm here today to say stop railroading geothermal through without disregard to public opinion.
When you have a subject as potentially contentious as AIDS or as energy, even though people may not understand that, after those hearings they understand how potentially contentious was. The Northeast of the United States has one view of energy. The West has another view, totally different. They're very hostile in their viewpoints towards each other. They're different nations when it comes to energy.
As Watkins traveled the country, he found that many states were already far ahead of Washington, saving energy through conservation, actively searching for alternatives to oil, and concerned they weren't seeing more federal leadership.
We have an energy policy today. It's very, very straightforward. We will go to war to keep the oil flowing from the Middle East, and we will do nothing else appreciably to develop alternative resources. That's the Bush strategy.
Dave Freeman runs Sacramento, California's municipal utility district.
I think that my constituents and everywhere, I think people know that we need to conserve and we need to get on to domestic clean resources. Every poll suggests that they do, but I don't want to get into the politics of it. Most students of the energy problem know that we're back to importing over half of our oil as we sit here and talk today, and no one seems to be concerned about it in the administration.
California, the world's 7th largest economy, embarked on its energy crusade in the 1970s. The goal was to reduce consumption and develop new, cleaner, and cheaper energy sources.
California has been particularly encouraging of this kind of ethic, customer value, environmental awareness and concern, but it's happening all over the country.
John Bryson is the chairman of Southern California Edison, a utility that was once run by Admiral Watkins' grandfather. Bryson testified at one of Watkins' public hearings.
Our focus here is not just on improving the existing automobile fleet, but just breaking the mold altogether. We need to think about new means of transportation.
Beginning in 1998, California will require that an increasing number of new cars must be powered by alternative fuels, including ones that emit no pollutants. Ultimately, says Dave Freeman, California's mandate may bring change to the entire U.S. auto industry.
It's already having an effect. That is the only reason, and they will tell you in Detroit, that is the only reason that they're building an electric car. In other words, it's the compulsion of law that has got their attention.
California has also made far-reaching changes in its utility regulatory structure, allowing utilities to make money by saving energy as well as selling it. The result?
California today has the lowest per capita growth in electrical demand in the nation.
Charles Imbrecht heads the California Energy Commission.
For a state that had a 25% population increase in just 10 years between 1980 and 1990, we would have had to build power plants from one end of California to the other to meet that kind of growth generated simply by population. But by contrast, we were able to develop a consensus that indeed energy efficiency was the least expensive and, I might add, the most environmentally benign option available to the people of California.
Secretary Watkins found that California's call for more conservation echoed across the country. In an interim report, he wrote, "The loudest single message was to increase energy efficiency in every sector of energy use." Back in Washington, some high-level officials didn't like what they were hearing. White House Chief of Staff John Sununu was one of several top administration officials who feared that Watkins' effort could lead to more government regulation, new taxes, and harm to the economy. The others were Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady, Richard Darman of the Office of Management and Budget, and Michael Boskin of the Council of Economic Advisors. They're known within the government as the Troika.
Who were these people in the Troika, and why didn't they want to see a change in our energy policy?
Well, the Troika consisted of people who were concerned with economic policy and had some very pronounced views, ideological views, about the proper role of government.
Congressman Howard Wolpe is a critic of the administration's energy plan.
Well, I think that the basic issue for them was an ideological view that the government should not be involved in the energy policy in any significant way. The marketplace was supposed to make all of the relevant decisions. And considerations of national security in terms of our vulnerability to a cutoff in oil supplies, they didn't care about that. Their only concern was keeping the government out of energy policy.
To ensure that Watkins' efforts did not result in an activist energy policy, the Troika and its allies moved to block him. They instructed the secretary only to prepare a list of options, not a comprehensive plan. Richard Smolensky was a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors at the time.
Who gave him his orders?
My understanding that the instruction to come forward with options, not with a straight document, came from Sununu.
But even Watkins' list of options went too far. One Treasury Department memo to the Department of Energy stated, "The options handed out yesterday in almost every case suggest that current energy policy is wrong and needs to be fixed, preferably by the government." The NES process continues to rely excessively on Secretary Watkins' hearing process. He should know that Treasury will very likely oppose any energy strategy that looks like the current list of options.
What was Treasury's problem? What were the options he was coming up with that bothered them?
I think what happened is that the administration suddenly became aware that the public was demanding a redirection of energy policy in a way that didn't coincide with the ideology of the administration. You had in the public hearings that had been held, one theme emphasized over and over again, and that was energy efficiency.
At the Pentagon, the defense establishment had its own point of view on energy policy. They saw energy as a national security issue. These are the facts that worry them. Since 1970, U.S. domestic oil production has been dropping. And by 2010, projections are that America will import up to 70% of its oil. Most of that increase will come from the Middle East.
On the oil side, the idea was to keep our oil dependence, our oil consumption from growing, because that meant inevitably dependence on Middle East oil.
Henry Rowan was Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs.
The plan that was proposed did not contain measures that were sufficient to limit, preferably even reduce, our oil consumption during the course of the 1990s, which seemed to me to be, from the energy policy standpoint, the key thing to do.
Rowan lobbied one federal agency after another, urging government action to reduce oil imports.
The best way would be through a general tax of some kind, a tax on oil consumption or imports, or maybe a gasoline tax.
Then, in the middle of Rowan's lobbying effort, Saddam Hussein seized Kuwaiti oil fields. At risk was 2/3 of the world's known oil reserves. The Pentagon was now facing the kind of war it wanted to avoid. At home, oil prices doubled. It was the third time in less than 2 decades that a surge in Middle Eastern oil prices helped push the economy into recession.
It has caused a lot of
We've had 3 oil shocks, 3 disruptions of supply in less than 20 years in that region.
That's why the president directed me to build a national energy strategy. That's the real driving force. I don't want to go through this again. I don't want the American people to go through it again. And of course, we didn't see Saddam Hussein on the horizon a year and a month hence.
Mr. President, it's an energy crisis. It's about oil.
Bennett Johnston is the chairman of the Senate Energy Committee, the most powerful seat in Congress on energy.
American young men and women are dying in the Gulf.
You spoke with Cheney, Powell, Scowcroft. They were your allies. What were their concerns?
Well, their concerns were the same as mine. That is that we were fighting a war over energy in order to protect our supplies of crude from the Middle East, and that they wanted an effective policy, as I did, to get our energy in America rather than having to import it.
An internal Energy Department document obtained by Frontline shows concretely that with 500,000 troops pouring into the Gulf, option after option supported by the Defense and State Departments was opposed by the President's economic advisors. Higher fuel efficiency standards for cars, opposed. Higher gasoline tax, opposed. They even opposed a small tax on oil to increase America's strategic petroleum reserves. These 570 million barrels of oil stored in Louisiana and Texas are currently the nation's first line of defense against an oil shock. Finally, in December of 1990, with the war only a month away, key cabinet officials met in the White House to settle their differences on the energy plan. Sources who attended the meeting report that National Security Advisor General Brent Scowcroft, who sided with the Pentagon, listened in growing disbelief as one conservation measure after another was rejected. Finally, he asked in frustration, "What are we fighting this war for, anyway?" Richard Smolensky also heard firsthand accounts of the meeting.
The reports I heard were basically that we have 500,000 troops in the Gulf. They're fighting in an oil-rich country. We've had an oil shock as a consequence of this whole affair. Why doesn't the strategy come to grips with this? My understanding is that was followed by silence. That's a hard question. The president had said, we're not fighting the war for oil.
Following the meeting, an official briefing paper was sent to the president. Obtained by Frontline, it argues that measures to reduce oil dependency are too costly. It then concludes, to the extent that we cannot substantially reduce our oil vulnerability problem through energy policies, we must prepare our diplomatic and defense assets to cope with its consequences. We cannot wish away the geology of world oil, and we cannot turn our backs on the Middle East.
As I report to you, air attacks are underway against military targets in Iraq.
Arnez bombs away. And impact point is steady.
As the president turned his attention to fighting the Gulf War, the Energy Department began preparing the administration's bill for Congress. Watkins had less than he wanted, but he still defended the bill.
All right, looks good.
We have the lowest...
Correspondent Nick Kotz asked Watkins why the administration killed so many conservation measures, including the defense establishment's call for a higher tax on gasoline.
Gasoline in this country is cheaper than bottled water. Why did the Bush administration turn down this option?
Everybody glibly talks about this gasoline tax. The Congress won't even put a nickel a gallon on it. And so there's a major political issue, and the American people don't like it. They see a 10% change in their gasoline cost, and they raise holy heck about it.
Even though they have the cheapest gas in the world.
Even though they have the cheapest gas in the world. The American people believe they have a right to 2.7 cars per family. Now, whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but that's what they want.
It's something that is really essential, a national energy strategy, and I want to announce it today.
When President Bush unveiled his energy bill, measures to lessen foreign oil dependence were modest. Domestic oil drilling, more natural gas use, and some shift to alternative fuels. The plan also contained a major revival of nuclear power.
And over the next 2 decades, this strategy will make us more energy efficient without new energy taxes. And it'll mean savings for consumers in energy costs, and it'll improve our energy security and reduce our vulnerability in the years ahead.
But whatever the president's claims were on energy security, his own report suggested otherwise. It stated, "Our nation and the world are likely to depend more on Middle East oil suppliers under any realistic scenario for the foreseeable future."
The Senate will come to order.
Where is our national energy policy? Why don't we have a national energy policy?
Spurred into action by the Gulf War, Bennett Johnston, the Senate's power broker on energy, introduced a bill much like the administration's.
Right after the Iraqi crisis, I was trying to bring the bill to the floor quickly at that time because I wanted the decision to be made with the Iraqi war fresh on their minds. But as the memory of that faded, so did the need to do something. American public, the attention span on this issue of energy is only stretches so far as the price of gasoline at the pump is up or down.
Johnston faced an uphill battle. Ready to pounce on the bill was an array of special interests with millions of dollars in their war chests. What happened over the next several months was a textbook example of political gridlock. Johnston's first problem was the environmental lobby. The bill contained a controversial proposal to drill for oil in an Alaskan wildlife refuge called Anwar.
1.5 million acres of coastal plain remain unguarded because of suspected oil and gas deposits. But already more than 90% of the North Slope is open to oil and gas development.
If we are concerned about energy dependency, then we save oil. And there are not provisions to do that in this bill. People around this country were at public hearings. They said they wanted to focus on conservation and renewables. And what they have instead in this piece of legislation is drilling for oil in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge.
To soften resistance to Alaskan oil drilling, Johnston had a plan. He decided to add conservation measures to the bill. The key measure would require automakers to increase fuel efficiency from 27 to 34 miles per gallon.
Particularly in light of the events of recent weeks in the Middle East,
But a freshman senator from Nevada, Richard Bryan, wanted more. He led other senators in a move to amend the bill, to raise the standard to 40 miles per gallon.
The bill would have achieved a savings of 2.5 million barrels of oil each and every day. Now, that's a permanent savings, not just a temporary phenomenon.
But Bryan's idea was politically unrealistic, and it mobilized another powerful lobby, the auto industry.
Job yes, Bryan no! Job yes, Bryan no! Job yes, Bryan no!
In a case of strange bedfellows, not uncommon in Washington, automakers joined environmentalists to fight the bill.
Powerful forces from the auto industry, which rolled out all the stops, the big three, were there mobilizing their lobbyist, the administration, Secretary of Transportation, then the Chief of Staff, John Sununu, and all of the organs of the federal government descended upon Capitol Hill and turned the tide against us. And then they organized an effort in which they publicized on television an auto crash, which we believe was not altogether fair in its presentation, suggesting that people who were favoring fuel economy were prepared to endanger the life and safety of America's motorists.
While smaller cars can save gas, U.S. government safety experts say they could cost you something far more precious. Fuel economy is important, but safety is vital.
I mean, it was essentially a scare campaign.
Senator Bryan, are you suggesting that the entire Bush administration is at the bidding of the automobile industry?
I am saying that they responded to the request of the industry. When they cracked the whip, the Bush administration made the trip.
Another key opponent of Bryan's proposal was the chairman of the House Energy Committee, John Dingell of Detroit.
Senator Bryan blames the automobile industry, the powerful lobby of the big three automakers, for defeating his proposal. Is he right?
Well, I think he's perhaps slightly right. I suspect he really ought to blame the Congress, which has considered the matter with a great deal of care, has come to the conclusion that it has an adverse impact upon jobs, particularly in the auto industry, that it will contribute very little in terms of saving fuel, and that it will cause enormous inconvenience and risk to the American motoring public, which is at greater risk in a small car than they are in a large car.
Studies by the Office of Technology Assessment and by the Department of Energy suggest that substantial increases in fuel economy are possible without sacrificing automobile size or performance. Why not capture those oil savings if they would be substantial?
Well, you're wrong. You're just plain flat wrong.
I'm just quoting OTA and DOE.
It does not say what you said. The harsh fact of the matter is that what the study said was that it is possible, using unproven technologies, untested technologies, in combinations and arrangements which have not yet been utilized on automobiles, to achieve some theoretical improvements in fuel efficiency of American automobiles.
The man responsible for the study doesn't see it that way.
What did you find that was possible about improving automobile fuel efficiency?
We found that it's possible to increase fuel efficiency substantially without compromising the size and performance of the current fleet.
Dr. Peter Blair heads the energy program at Congress's Office of Technology Assessment.
If we really concentrated on automobile fuel efficiency, how much oil could we save?
On the order of 2 million barrels a day, the same perhaps as that we might get from an aggressive alternative fuels program.
On this vote, the yeas are 50, the nays are 44. The motion to proceed is not agreed to.
With the energy bill opposed by two powerful lobbies, the bill died on the Senate floor. There was no help from the White House.
And I think the reason is that some in the White House were so afraid of CAFE standards, fuel efficiency standards, that they were willing to junk the whole bill. Mr. President, we may have defeated national energy policy here today, comprehensive national energy policy, but we have not defeated the problem.
3 months later, Senator Johnston surprised everyone by bringing the energy bill back to the Senate floor.
Calendar 393 S 2166, a bill to reduce the nation's dependence on imported oil to provide for the energy security of the nation and for other purposes.
This time, both controversial provisions, Alaskan oil drilling and auto fuel efficiency, were sacrificed altogether. But there was more trouble. Another senator, Republican James Jeffords of Vermont, made another attempt to toughen the legislation. His idea was endorsed by a majority of his Senate colleagues, but it alarmed the oil lobby.
What my amendment will do is to create a free market for domestic producers. That's right. My amendment will create a free market, a market safe from the power and the hammer of OPEC.
In short, Jeffords wanted to force the oil companies to sell less gasoline and more alternative fuels such as methanol and natural gas. The oil companies knew this would cut into their profits.
You proposed a plan that would have required that our fuel supply include 10% domestically produced alternative fuels by the year 2000, 30% by 2010. What did you hope to achieve?
Energy independence.
To enlist the president's support, Jeffords went to the White House.
I went down there well prepared because I knew that this was a critical juncture in the deliberations. When it came my time to talk, I asked the president and suggested that this country ought to be energy independent. And he agreed. He said, yes, doesn't our plan get us there? And I said, no, Mr. President, it does not. And I had prepared documents that had been prepared from DOE information, and I distributed those around the room. He looked at them briefly, and then he looked at the Secretary of Energy and said, Jim, you get together with Senator Jeffords and see if you can work something out here.
But Jeffords' efforts were in vain.
On the motion,
his majority of votes in the Senate was evaporating.
7 yeas and 39 nays. The amendment is tabled.
We asked Senator Jeffords if his colleagues had heard from the oil lobby.
Yes, they said, boy, the oil companies are really down on your amendment. And one of them even mentioned, you know, that this is going to cost my campaign money if I stick with you.
And so what did that senator do?
Voted against me.
Energy interests know how to make friends in Congress. Over the past 7 years, the oil industry has pumped $18 million into congressional campaigns. The auto industry has contributed more than $11 million.
Well, I knew that big oil was powerful, but I didn't realize how powerful. I didn't realize that they could change what I had done to build support for it. And when they moved in full bore, they just turned things around much more successfully than I anticipated.
Mr. Mack, Mr. McCain, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Metzenbaum.
With the most controversial provisions defeated, the Senate passed a compromise energy bill in February of 1992.
The bill is passed 94-4.
The most surprising battle on the energy bill was not about oil, but about where the U.S. will get its electricity. 55% of electricity is now generated by burning coal. Over 20% comes from nuclear power. The rest comes from burning oil and natural gas and from hydroelectric plants. To help meet future needs, the administration is committed to a major revival of nuclear power. They're calling for more than 100 new nuclear power plants to be built over the next 40 years. And Congress has approved the administration's proposal making it easier to license nuclear plants. Of all energy measures backed by Washington, none faces greater challenges.
Now, we made a mistake. We goofed at 3 Mile Island, okay? And I understand that. But remember, we didn't kill anybody. We didn't pollute the environment outside that building. We had a mess inside, as you know, a couple $1 billion worth to clean up. But still, You compare that with energy sources around the world in terms of casualties, fatalities, damaging the environment and the communities around the environment, and we've done a terrific job.
Many supporters of nuclear power are looking to Florida, a state with fast-growing power needs, to lead the nuclear revival. Florida Power Corporation's president, Alan Kiesler.
I think when you look at the big picture, nuclear energy is the only economically viable alternative that we as a country have today. The most recent advertisement has tried to let people know that from an environmental point of view, that we had a much less environmental impact on an area with nuclear generation than with any other form of generation that was fossil fuel driven.
I'm calling from the Florida Consumer Action Network, and I was just calling...
But many Florida citizens are organizing to pursue another solution, conservation.
Right now, we're working for a responsible energy policy that protects our environment and our pocketbooks. Did you know that Florida residents use more power per person than almost any other state?
They point out that utilities make money by selling more power. Instead, they want the utility industry to be given incentives to sell less.
The thing is that we don't have hardly any conservation programs in this state. We don't encourage efficiency at all. In fact, we have
In that way, they hope to reduce future use by up to 40%. Kiesler says it won't work.
I do not believe that we can control 40% of our demand going forward as a state through demand limiting just devices. I just don't think that's feasible, and I think we will find ourselves in a great problem if we attempt to do it that way.
But even many utility executives believe that Kiesler and Washington are headed in the wrong direction. Nuclear power, they say, is just too expensive. Utility executive Dave Freeman has shut down nuclear power plants in both California and Tennessee.
They make a big deal out of shortening the licensing process as though that were the problem rather than the reactors themselves being the problem. I'm not too concerned about the streamlining of the nuclear licensing process because nobody's going to buy those suckers. No sane capitalist has bought one in 12 years.
Admiral, we can't find a single company in the country that's planning to order a new nuclear plant.
Too often we look at the past and say, well, how can the future be bright if the past is so dark? The nuclear is going to be pre-licensed, 7-year return on investment instead of 14 years today, new technology, passively safe, and is attractive to the utility industry. They already know that. So you're going to see over the next 2 years the rebirth of nuclear power, providing we solve the waste problem.
I didn't see it, so what was coming in?
For the last 40 years, scientists have searched for a way to safely store nuclear waste. During that time, 22,000 metric tons of it have piled up at the nation's 75 nuclear plants with no place to go. Congress has ordered a $6 billion study to see whether Yucca Mountain in Nevada could be a safe repository where waste would be stored for 10,000 years.
Some of your own DOE scientists still have doubts about whether Yucca is going to be safe.
1 or 2. Let's take a look at the large body of scientific evidence that says you're on the right track.
Geologically, this region of the Earth is very unstable.
Don Livingston is one of 2 DOE scientists who recently resigned in protest over how the government is handling the Yucca Mountain study.
What are the odds of groundwater coming up through the mountain and spreading waste?
Well, I think they're probably pretty good. I think there's a lot of evidence that that's happened in the recent past.
One day after we visited Yucca Mountain, an earthquake rocked the area, causing $1 million worth of damage to the Department of Energy's Yucca headquarters.
Why is it so important to the nuclear industry that this site go ahead and that they be allowed to bury waste here?
Because nuclear waste is piling up all over the United States. Right now, we can store the waste at the plants, but within the next 14 to 20 years, that's not going to be possible. So there has to be some place to put the waste.
Don Williams was hired by the nuclear industry to help run a $9 million media campaign called the Nevada Initiative to soften resistance to the proposed Yucca repository. According to this confidential memo, he can count on help from Washington. The memo, sent by a nuclear trade association to its members, boasts that the nuclear industry has established a working alliance with the Department of Energy. It calls for a scientific truth squad to neutralize political resistance. When the memo was leaked, it became a political embarrassment.
The memo.
It was constructed by idiots or an idiot or idiots unknown.
High-level nuclear waste. Could a traffic accident cause it to leak?
I'm Ron Vito, and the answer is no.
But in spite of all the PR, the choice of Yucca Mountain may have less to do with science than with old-fashioned politics.
Why was Yucca Mountain chosen as the sole testing site for a nuclear waste repository?
It was a political decision, one where the strong beat up on the weak and take advantage of a small state with a small congressional delegation. In 1987, in the still of the night, the 1982 Nuclear Waste Policy Act was changed so that rather than looking for 3 sites, only one would be examined, and that's the one at Yucca Mountain.
We were astounded to hear that even the nuclear industry's paid spokesman, Williams, agreed about why his state was chosen.
It's a political reason that we have one of the smallest congressional delegations in Washington, and we got screwed.
You got screwed because you didn't have clout?
Exactly.
Still, Williams believes the waste will be safe and is continuing to lobby for its storage in Nevada.
The harsh fact of the matter is that if we're to have an energy policy, we have to store our spent nuclear waste, particularly the high-level stuff, in a way which is safe and environmentally sound to the greatest degree that we can. And the consensus seems to be that the best place for this is Nevada.
Chairman Dingell of Detroit pushed legislation to prevent Nevada from stopping the Yucca Mountain study. Some insiders say that Dingell wanted to settle a score with Nevada's Senator Bryan, who had previously challenged him over auto efficiency standards.
Several people, both in politics and out of politics, have told us that you told them you were going to teach Senator Bryan a lesson for pushing an increase in auto fuel efficiency standards.
I have no recollection of that.
You never told anybody that you were upset with Senator Bryan?
No.
About his bill?
No.
What did Congressman Dingell say about Senator Bryan?
Well, that he was very concerned over his seeming unwillingness to compromise on the fuel efficiency legislation.
Jan Jones, the mayor of Las Vegas, spoke to Congressman Dingell while on a trip to Washington.
There's no question but that the attitude on the part of Congress changed significantly when the cafe issue came to the forefront, that they took a much harder approach with Nevada.
The further point that they make, Mr. Chairman, is that there was a connection between Bryan pushing his fuel efficiency bill and your pushing language into the current energy law to clear the way for the Yucca Mountain testing.
Well, if you look at the history of it, you'll find that that was inserted by Mr. Sharp's subcommittee. And I won't say that I found any distress in the matter, but it was not put in by me. It was put in by the subcommittee.
You're smiling.
Of course.
No distress at Senator Bryan having a little distress.
Oh, I'm always sad when colleagues and friends like Senator Bryan.
Eventually, Congress dropped Dingell's Yucca Mountain provision, but testing is continuing today under a court order. The question of where to put its waste isn't the only issue where the nuclear industry faces stiff opposition.
It is our belief that over a 30-year period of time, this lake will eventually become polluted with various chemicals from this plant, uranium being one of them.
Tony Johnson is leading the fight against building a uranium enrichment plant in Homer, Louisiana. But his senator, Bennett Johnston, has pushed legislation through Congress to bring the plant and its 200 jobs here.
Why do you think the senator wants the plant here?
I have a copy, a printout of Senator Johnson's campaign contributions for the last election, and I think that speaks for itself. Huge amounts of money was given to him by the nuclear power industry.
Between 1985 and 1992, the nuclear industry spent $16 million on congressional campaign contributions. Johnston, at $165,000, was the leading recipient.
Isn't there the impression that it is trying to buy influence?
That's why I am for campaign finance reform, to limit the amount of contributions, to limit the amount that can be spent, and to provide for partial public financing. I am for that. But as long as we are playing football with an 11-man team, I'm going to put all 11 men on the field. And as a matter of fact, I will plead guilty to voting for and sometimes sponsoring amendments myself, if that does not come as too much of a shock to my colleagues, that I'm willing to admit that politics occasionally creeps into the equation, and it does with all of us.
The government's commitment to nuclear power means less money for renewable technologies like wind and solar power.
These collectors, just like this, current generation of collectors, if put on Edwards Air Force Base, which is just a few miles in that direction, could supply all of the electricity for the state of California.
Newton Becker, the chairman of Luz International, says his industry needs the kind of benefits Washington gives traditional energy interests. His company produces 90% of the world's solar electricity, but it's now in bankruptcy.
What will it take for the solar industry to compete and prosper?
It will take a level playing field in a number of areas. One area has to be the tax benefit area. The other area has to be the environmental area. For example, these solar fields that you see here do not pollute. Nevertheless, we don't get any more for our electricity than a nearby gas plant or a nearby oil-fired plant or even a coal plant that does pollute. They don't get penalized, we don't get a benefit. It's not a level playing field.
The lack of a level playing field is especially evident when it comes to government research and development money. Since 1973, more than half of the $38 billion spent by the government on energy research was funneled into nuclear power. A quarter has gone to fossil fuel technologies like coal, oil, and natural gas. Only about a fifth has gone to conservation and renewable technologies. Yet in 1991, Secretary Watkins' own staff ranked conservation and renewables, such as solar and wind energy, as their top energy priorities for R&D money. Nuclear and coal received the lowest priority rating.
There was a perfect inverse correlation. That is, all of the technologies that received the highest recommendation for funding and emphasis by the Office on Policy received the least funding. All of the technologies that were given the lowest ratings by the Office on Policy received the highest funding in the budget recommendations submitted by the President.
Why did you in the White House reverse your staff on those recommendations?
Wait a minute now. Let's talk about the staff. This department never had any strategic planning section. It never even had a good policy section. It didn't know what it was doing on budget preparation. The problem is that they got mixed up in terms of dollars versus policy, and they began to transfer dollars from a research project in nuclear over into renewables, and you can't do that. You either build something or you don't. I'm building two teams to try to find out which passively safe reactor is right, and I have to spend big dollars, hundreds of millions, and I can't take $100 million and throw it over here. And I told them that their analysis was a bogus analysis. So, you know, my staff does not run this department. I do.
In the end, the bill that Congress sent to the President will do little to change the current energy priorities. Meanwhile, Admiral Watkins has announced he is retiring as Secretary of Energy. He says he's proud of the energy plan he has helped craft.
I feel really pretty good about it. I'm amazed that we have an energy bill. Did I get all I want? No. Am I frustrated? Frankly, no. Not now. I'm frustrated that I can't get some things through, but after all, how about 90% of the loaf?
How would you rate what this plan does? Big changes, medium changes, changes at the margins?
Changes at the margins, beneficial changes, not dramatic, certainly not revolutionary.
We have a failure of political will, of political leadership, a failure of the media properly to cooperate. I mean, it's an American failure from top to bottom, from the president, from the Congress, from the media, from the people, all cooperating to give us bad energy policy. Now, this bill's going to do a great deal to solve that problem, but not everything, and so there's some big gaps.
The changes are modest. Deregulation of the utility industry, more use of natural gas, small steps to conserve energy and encourage use of alternative energy sources. But these measures skirt the central problem, where we get our energy and how we use it. To address problems like these, we need to go beyond the politics of gridlock, to reconcile what Americans want with what America needs. 2 years ago, in the midst of the Gulf War, Americans briefly shared a common sense of urgency about the danger of being so dependent on foreign oil. Now it's an election year. Gasoline is cheap again, and few Americans are paying much attention.
Funding for Frontline is provided by the financial support of viewers like you and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. Additional funding provided by these funders. For video cassette information about this program, please call this toll-free number.
This is PBS.
Jobs, education.
The Cold War is over and freedom finished first.
2 men, 2 ambitions, 1 choice. How well do we know the next president? In a 2-hour campaign special, Frontline examines how the lives of these men have shaped their run for the White House.
He had so much respect for Jack Kennedy, but to be able to meet him, to be able to shake his hand, it was important to him. And when he came back with the picture of himself and Jack Kennedy, I knew it was politics for him. I knew it was.
I think that there are people who may take a view that he's led a protected life, and up till the time that he went away to service, why, that was probably so. You know, he put down a first baseman's glove and picked up an airplane.
You have to understand the time. We
were torn morally, but faced with the reality of Vietnam, we didn't know what to do.
He was in a dilemma. He doesn't want to fight and die in an unpopular war, but he doesn't want to sacrifice his political career by not going.
This Frontline special charts the promise of the candidate's early rise and the impact of sudden defeat.
Sitting in a suite up in that hotel when the returns were in, it's kind of one of those situations where you hate to approach the candidate because you just don't have any good news. And it's like being on a train going 180 miles an hour and suddenly you hit a brick wall. And I think that's the way he felt at that moment.
I regret that I will not have 2 more years to serve as governor.
Bill Clinton was stunned by his defeat. There was an absolute feeling of disbelief. It looked like people look at the scene of a natural disaster, a plane crash, or a drowning, that you just simply can't believe what happened.
Defeated, both men had to find another way to the top, reinventing themselves, making new accommodations to power.
Ambassador Bush to be director of the Central Intelligence Agency.
He's been very loyal and intensely loyal to the people that he served. And some of those people have not been worthy of it.
Arkansas sent out a signal to business and said, hey, come take advantage of us. And they did.
Had Governor Clinton taken on those entities, I don't believe that he could have survived this many terms. It would have cost him his political aspirations.
I proudly accept your nomination
for President of the United States.
Frontline measures the character of the men who would be president. The Choice, a PBS campaign special.
For a printed transcript of this or any Frontline program, please write to this address.
This is Louisiana Public Broadcasting.
Harry Truman ran as an underdog, just as I am, and he liked it, and so do I.
We're going to do what Harry Truman did for the next 57 days. Go across this country, give them hell, and make America what it ought to be again.
The candidates are looking for that Truman magic this year, the magic that produced the biggest election surprise in our history. Join us as we retell the story of the great upset of '48.
On LPB, Monday night at 9.
Good evening, I'm Roger Mudd. So far in this presidential campaign, both candidates have said they can fix America's health care crisis.
My plan will help 90 million Americans afford private insurance.
He won't take on the big insurance companies, but I will.
Join us for